What's going on, guys? My name is Wade with TechDaily, and in this video, we're going to be doing a speed test comparison between the new iPhone SE and the iPhone 8, iPhone 7, and iPhone 6. Now, the reason I chose these phones for this test is because I think for a lot of people considering the new iPhone SE, these are probably the phones they'll be coming from. They all have the same design, after all, with Touch ID and the home button. The SE, even though it is a new 2020 device, kept everything the same. So I consider all these iPhones to be the same sort of family of devices that appeal to certain folks who like this setup. Now, if you're wondering why I threw in the iPhone 6 rather than the 6S, there's two reasons for that. The first is simply that I don't have a 6S to use, unfortunately, so that's a bummer. But also, the iPhone 6 is stuck on iOS 12, while all the others run iOS 13. And I wanted to have this unsupported device as sort of an extreme with the older OS and older hardware to really give you some perspective. All the other iPhones have been updated to the latest iOS that's currently out, which at the time of filming this video is iOS 13.4.1. And like I said, the final update supported on the iPhone 6 is iOS 12.4.6. Also, all these phones have been fully charged to their maximum capacity, as close to 100% as I could get them, so you can sort of see the battery drain throughout the video too. However, each of these phones has different battery health percentages, which impacts their longevity and their maximum capacity. But realistically, I think this makes the test more fair only because most people's older iPhones, like the 6, 7, and 8, likely don't have 100% battery health anymore anyway, and this is more so what they're currently working with. So for the purposes of this test, we're just going to go ahead and run through some everyday apps, see how the load times are. We'll also do some gaming comparisons too, and I'll go over the specs and benchmark scores as well, so you can get a more concrete result and numerical value for each phone in regards to their capabilities. This isn't a very scientific test, obviously. We're going to just keep things simple, but hopefully by the end, you'll be able to get a feel for how these phones perform, the speed and performance differences between them, and whether or not you feel it's worth upgrading if you have one of these devices. Of course, all these phones have the exact same apps downloaded. They're all set up the same way too. There's no hidden extras or anything like that anywhere. And I've quit everything as well, so nothing is preloaded. I've tried to keep it as identical as possible. The only thing I need to point out though is that the iPhone 6 can't hold as many apps as the other phones since it's only 16 gigabytes, and that's why it's missing a couple. It just simply ran out of space. The first thing I want to do is run a couple of the benchmark tests. This first one is the Antutu app, and I like running this one because it's a true visual of what exactly is being tested. You can see it's rendering a whole bunch of different graphics and visuals here. It takes quite a while, which is why I sped this up. And while this test runs, I'll go over what's inside each of these phones so you have an idea. The iPhone 6 has the A8 processor from 2014 and just 1 gig of RAM. The iPhone 7 has the A10 Fusion chipset from 2016 and 2 gigabytes of RAM. The iPhone 8 has Apple's A11 Bionic processor from 2017 and 2 gigabytes of RAM as well. And the newest phone, the iPhone SE, obviously has the most powerful and newest A13 Bionic processor from 2019 and 3 gigabytes of RAM. And the end results show the iPhone 6 gets a total score of 82,187. The iPhone 7 is significantly higher at 180,662. The iPhone 8 is only a bit better than that at 236,127. And the new iPhone SE gets almost double that score at 440,538. And just as a side note, if you run these tests on your own devices, you may get a slightly different result, but the final number should at least be close as long as you have the same phone. To start off, we'll go ahead and keep things simple by comparing some of the stock iOS apps and seeing the load times from each phone. What surprised me the most was actually just how close these phones were, at least initially. Even the iPhone 6 with some of these stock apps seem to be keeping up for the most part. They're all within about a half a second of each other, maybe even less than that. And I think the thing that's helping the iPhone 7 and iPhone 8 the most is just the fact that Apple has really optimized iOS 13 to work well on older devices. It really isn't until we start to load some bigger, more complicated apps that the upgraded specs on the iPhone SE stand out a bit. But at least with most of the regular iOS apps that ship with these phones, and really I think with iOS as a whole, the difference across the iPhone SE, the iPhone 8, and the iPhone 7 isn't too drastic yet. yet. Obviously though, the poor old iPhone 6 on iOS 12 is starting to struggle to keep up as we load more and more apps, and as we start to get into some of the graphics heavy stuff. But that's expected, and more than anything, I think it just shows now just how dated this device really is. Obviously, the standard iOS apps aren't the only ones you'll be using, and as we start to venture off into third-party apps from the App Store, this is where these phones start to differ. Rather than load times being within the blink of an eye of each other on these phones, I think with the iPhone 7 and iPhone 8 now, they're anywhere between 1 and 3 seconds off the pace of the iPhone SE in some cases. And the iPhone 6 is just not even close now. I don't want to say it's unusable. It still works and everything loads eventually, but the difference is really obvious. Keep in mind, the apps we've tested up to this point haven't really been anything too crazy. Mostly the stuff you'd be using every day: Twitter, Instagram, some shopping apps, things like that. Nothing really all that intense or difficult for these phones. And any difference you do see will be amplified in a minute when we load up some big graphics heavy games. I know maybe half a second or a second of load time difference isn't huge, but over time it does kind of start to add up. And like I said, if the iPhone SE is a half a second faster loading a relatively simple app like Twitter, when you're loading up something big, the difference becomes even more significant. So let's actually jump into some games. The first one is a game you actually see me use a lot in my videos. It's Asphalt 9 Legends, and you can see we're starting to get a more significant difference between the phones. I think the iPhone 7 and iPhone 8 are kind of close, but the iPhone SE is definitely ahead of them both by a decent margin. Now, unfortunately, this is where we sort of have to say goodbye to the iPhone 6. I'm going to keep it up here throughout the rest of the video, but the load times were so bad that I had to speed things up, no joke, 800%. This phone is just not even in the same realm anymore as the rest. Next up, we've got another favorite racing game of mine, Real Racing 3. This app is actually massive for whatever reason, like multiple gigabytes on the phone, so there's a lot to load and manage. And for the first time, I noticed that the iPhone 7 started to lag behind even further. Still not bad, within a couple seconds, but it's starting to fall behind just a bit. And obviously, once again, the iPhone 6 is stuck taking multiple minutes to load this game. One of the most popular mobile games still right now is PUBG. I know this is another pretty big, intense game that takes up a bit of time to load. These phones actually were a little closer this time around, and surprisingly, PUBG is actually still supported on the iPhone 6, which is kind of interesting. Next up is Raid Shadow Legends, which, by the way, shout out to their marketing team, because as annoying as their ads are with all those big YouTubers, this is a game I don't forget, so they're doing something right, I guess. But this is another pretty big and obviously very graphics-heavy game that requires a lot of processing power to get through it. And we're still seeing a couple seconds difference between the iPhone 7, iPhone 8, and SE. And again, a couple minutes difference between the iPhone 6, which, just as a reminder, is being sped up. Last on the list here is an app I used to play all the time, Words with Friends. This obviously is not a very complicated game to load, but with all the apps and pop-ups and things, and the fact that it's kind of an older app in general, it still takes a little bit of time to get up there. Interestingly enough, in this case, these phones for this app are back to being pretty close, and even the iPhone 6 isn't that far off. One other thing I wanted to show you guys, as far as internet browsing speeds, there's actually some difference here too. Now, there are a number of other factors that come into play. Obviously, your Wi-Fi and internet speeds in general have a lot to do with it, and if you have a bunch of people on the network, it may affect things too. But in general, things are kind of close here, except obviously with the iPhone 6. And with each release, Apple does tend to update the Wi-Fi and network bands on their phones a little bit. So like I said, things are usually quicker on the newer devices in general. If you're curious, here's a simple internet speed test that I did with these phones. These were not run at the same time. They were all done one by one to hopefully maximize the results and not interfere with one another either. I was actually surprised to see that the speeds the phones were getting were nearly identical, but like I said, load times in general favored the iPhone SE. The poor iPhone 6 on the end there though definitely seems to not be taking full advantage of the Wi-Fi network. And finally, finally, at the end of all these tests now, you can kind of see how the batteries held up. The iPhone SE did a pretty nice job. It obviously still has 100% battery health since it's a new phone. All the other devices lost a significant amount of battery life in a relatively short time, and I know a lot of that has to do with their poor battery health. But in general, you're definitely going to be seeing better battery life overall on the iPhone SE by a few hours at least. So here are my final thoughts on this speed test. First off, if you have an iPhone 6, please, it's time to upgrade. Save yourself from the torture. If you have an iPhone 7 or iPhone 8, you probably won't notice a huge difference jumping to the new iPhone SE if you mainly use simple everyday apps. The real difference in performance is going to come with graphics-heavy games and bigger, more complicated apps. The difference may be 2 or 3 seconds in some cases, but it's still something. Does that warrant an upgrade? I think that's kind of up to you to decide. I will say though that the iPhone SE has some other upgrades, like a better camera for example, that may make it a worthwhile purchase too, beyond just the internal spec bump. So there you go. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know what you thought of these results. Were you surprised how close they were? Let me know in the comments down below. I'd love to know your thoughts, of course. Also, be sure to follow TechDaily on Twitter and subscribe to the TechDaily YouTube channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys later.